Okay, everyone, this is my spoiler review of X-Men, the animated series, Season 1, Episode 10, Come the Apocalypse. This originally came out February 27th, 1993. Before I jump into this review, please hit that subscribe button. This is a new channel that's going to be covering everything X-Men, so make sure to follow along. Now we see that Adler is with Angel, and that we learn Angel funded this project, sadly, and he's going to be the first victim of it. And we'll see that Adler reveals herself as Mystique to Angel, and that's when Apocalypse shows up and is like, you'll be rewarded, Mystique. The rest will be my slaves. So this is leading off when we learned the last episode that that is the point of this machine. And we get some very villainous lines here from Apocalypse. It's a really cool line. He's like, increase the power. I want to hear the cries of a future being born. And it's cool because in this moment, we're seeing Angel become Archangel. Now, I've said in my previous reviews, I love when the show takes the great theme song and does different versions of it. And they sneak in here like this slow 80s synth version when Professor X and the X-Men are reflecting on how mutants who should accept who they are. But coming through the door is Mystique posing as Angel, yelling, I'm cured. And Cyclops goes, there's nothing wrong with us that needs to be cured. And the great line Mystique has here is, look me in the eye and tell me that. But I love Mystique as Angel when she says, you won't be laughed at or feared anymore. And the mutants in the bar are like, yeah, woo! Like they don't care what Cyclops is saying. They're down. And then Angel goes, who wants to be normal? And that old lady Morlock we saw in the sewer episodes like, me! I thought that was so funny. Why was that line so intense? But a nice touch that pays off from the last episode's good storytelling about Rogue is Rogue still is the last one to leave the pub of the X-Men and pauses and remembers being at that spot, and probably a second thought about if she's doing the right thing, if she should take this opportunity to become human. So throughout this episode, we're going to see a lot of monologuing by Apocalypse. He's like, I'm the one to purify the world. The evil of human and mutant shall be cut away. So we see he also doesn't want mutants there either. So that's a big difference between him and Magneto. We get a lot of telling about Apocalypse and what he's like and that he's crazy and he just wants to rid everything on the earth. But I wish we got just a little bit of backstory or explanation from his own mouth to his ways. Just a little bit more sprinkled in, and I hope that the show goes into that more as well. That's really what was lacking for me in his really main episode so far. Here he plays like as your classic kind of tropey, just evil villain for the sake of hating everything and evil. But we get to see the four horsemen here: famine, pestilence, war, and death, who's the winged avenger, which is really cool. He announces that, and that's being Archangel. Now Gambit again is being creepy to Rogue, at this time at the pool table, and they're messing with each other with their powers in the game, and then Jean steps in and makes Gambit's cue ball fly. But the best part of this scene is Storm goes, Gambit, the term rec room does not mean that you must wreck it. And Gambit has the best line of the episode where he goes, Storm makes jokes now? What's next? I thought that was great. Now, where the big events happen is we go to Paris, and this is the World Peace Conference, and it's a talk about disarming weapons. But we see the chairman comes out, and he's like, can we disarm when mutants walk among us? But this is where he's interrupted by Apocalypse, who's transforming out of a gargoyle statue. And he's like, fools, you bleat the future like a herd of sheep. I will give you the future right now. And the people just book it after cheering on the talk of possibly keeping weapons against mutants. And it's funny in animation too, where you see things that are just absolutely insane, like Archangel just cuts something of a helicopter and it casually just blows up the Eiffel Tower. There's not really much reaction to the Eiffel Tower going down in this episode. But even what I love about animation is when you get cinematic type shots that are really clever. I love when Pestilence attacks the news anchor and the cameraman, and the camera goes to the ground, and we get that shot of Apocalypse that's really cool from the camera on the ground. It's a perfect cut to the X-Men watching that shot on TV. And this is where Professor X is like, this is what I feared the most, a powerful mutant driven completely mad by his powers, and explains this isn't like Magneto or the conspirators they face that can be appealed to, reason with. So I just, again, would have wished just a little more from viewing Apocalypse with this behavior or why he's doing it than word of mouth in this episode in particular. Where I've praised the show for breadcrumbs and sprinkling hints at things, I feel like there was almost too much breadcrumbs here and we needed a little more meat and explanation. Because this is some like insane stuff he's doing, Apocalypse, in this huge threat. And if he's going to be talked about as a bigger threat than Magneto, I want to know more about him. Now, Professor X sends Rogue to look for Archangel and look into the cure Adler was making and used it as a key against Apocalypse. But I love when Rogue flies to Muir Island, like right when she's overhead and about to land. Our hint that she's in Scotland is bagpipes start playing, and they're really quick, so I thought that was just classic 90s animation type of thing you would hear. Now, one of my favorite moments in this episode is when she calls for Dr. Adler. We see that shot of Mystique in the shadows, and it starts from her feet up. So cool. And we get to also see a moment where she almost looks like Two-Face, where she's half Dr. Adler, half Mystique. So again, like I've said in previous reviews, I love Mystique, and I really love what they do with her in this animated series so far. And Rogue has some of the best lines in this show per usual, and she reacts to a giant hole in the ceiling and says, "You thinking about putting in a skylight, Doc?" I thought that was so good. Now Mystique reveals herself and says the treatment turns mutants into slaves, makes them hate everyone, humans and mutants, like Apocalypse does. Again, more telling, but again, I just wish we got more of showing of this, or why, the why of it all. Now, one of the most awkward line deliveries in the show today comes with Mystique here, where she's like, "He has a secret command center buried under Stonehenge, and there's this giant pause," and she goes, "In England." I thought that was so funny. Like, how did that happen? But we see Mystique destroys the machine and actually escapes, and she's still for Apocalypse, and is like, no one will stop Apocalypse. Now the big battle happens here. The X-Men show up to Paris, and the theme music just starts cranking here, and you'll see from this moment on, this episode is probably the most action-packed episode we've seen in the show yet. So I'm sure for the kids, this one is an absolute joy to watch. But one of my favorite moments is when Storm blinds the Horseman in the fog, and she says for the fog to rise. That was so awesome. And Cyclops then just shoots Pestilence down onto a bus, and they all just watch. And Wolverine always gets a good line, and he gets another one here when he grabs onto War, and he's like, "Don't you think we're getting a little carried away here?" And we get this bigger showdown when it's Rogue shows up to Apocalypse, and then the Horsemen come, the X-Men were all here. But what I really liked about this moment was they highlighted Rogue taking off her gloves, and she says, "I gotta slow these folks down." But where a lot of things people wouldn't catch, that's why she's wearing gloves, right? So she doesn't just absorb everything she touches, and she absorbs Archangel's bad energy out of him, and we get that terrifying scream again, like we heard in the Juggernaut episode when she absorbed Juggernaut thoughts. And we see Warren Worthington the Third comes back like, "What have I done?" And he's telling everyone to stop. But Apocalypse and the Horsemen get away, and Warren says, "I wanted to be normal, but all I did was prove that I'm capable of terrible evil." But Rogue says, "It wasn't your fault. I wanted to deny myself too for a time. That could have been me helping that man." So this is really good writing and paying off from the previous episode. And she says, "Don't worry, I took the evil away when I touched you. It's part of me now." And Warren says, "I just hope you're strong enough to control it. I wasn't." And then he flies away, and it just ends. It's like this abrupt, somber ending, especially for a kid's show. Like, definitely the most abrupt ending of the show to date, which was a little weird because it sets up, like, you see the back of Rogue and Cyclops looking at him flying away. You thought we get the reaction shot or they say one more line. It just ends, and it goes to the rock music ending credits. So that was strange, but again, really good writing though in that last final scene, and I like how they're setting up, especially that mystery of like, what's going to happen to Rogue now? Can she handle this evil that Angel clearly couldn't? So overall, I'm giving this episode a 8. I like this episode. I don't love it. I really think it just needed a little more explanation about Apocalypse and his motivations, as crazy as he is. Just give us something more, because then it kind of gets into that tropey villain who's just evil to be evil and wants everything just destroyed in his own power. So that would be my biggest problem with this episode, but I still enjoyed it. It's really action-packed, and again, you gotta remember it's a kid's show, so in the department of the kid audience, this is probably like very popular because of how much action's in it. You're going to see really cool things with the X-Men versus Apocalypse. But this is that type of episode where a lot of the writing, you just want more. It's just kind of rolling with the punches here. But like I point out, I love that moment with Mystique in the shadows. There's some really cool shots, like the camera angle from the ground. And it still feels like setup to, in a way, in its introduction, really getting time with Apocalypse here and a focused episode on him. So it gets me intrigued for where the season's going to go, especially with having a Rogue at the end. So like I said, I'm giving it an 8. It's not one of my favorites, but it's not bad either. I think it's just solid all around. Let me know what you thought of this episode. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I read every comment. Try to respond as many as I can. And please subscribe. And I'll see you next time.